Welcome back, students. Let's proceed with our story, A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot. In the previous video, we have seen that Tricky was taken to the hospital and he was now under the charge of Dr. Herriot. Now, in the remaining part, we will find out how the doctor was able to have a victory over this surgery. Now, Harriet took Tricky at his surgery. At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me, and when he entered, there were other dogs also which had been there for a long time. They all came very quickly, ran towards Harriet as they knew him so well. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. Tricky was very ill and he had lost all his energy, so he did not react to this noisy group of dogs. Those were big hounds, but when he was placed on the carpet, he laid there without any movement. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So other dogs came near him and started sniffing as it was something new to them, but finding him very uninteresting and without any motion, they ignored him and moved away. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. Harriet made the dog comfortable by placing him in a warm, loose box and tried to keep him with the other dogs. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. So now the doctor knew what to do. He was closely watching the condition of the dog. So he kept him only on water and avoided any food for the next 2 days. It was not the way Mrs. Pumphrey had been treating the dog. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings. And on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So, at the end of the second day, some positive change was being seen in the dog. He started reacting to the surrounding and he began to whimper. Whimper means creating a low, feeble sound when he heard the other dogs in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe the greyhound and his friends. So Tricky tried to move unsteadily towards the narrator, but immediately other dogs, there was a greyhound, Joe and his friends, they all tried to cover up Tricky with their huge body. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. So they were trying to just find out what this new creature was or probably this new member in their family. And after being convinced that it belonged to their group now, they all moved away to the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Tricky by now had also been used to seeing these dogs around, so it also tried to follow, but he could not move very quickly due to its excessive fat, so it seemed as if he was rolling towards. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush, followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. It was the feeding time, and the narrator watched that how the dogs came running towards the food and have a big attack on the bowls. Tristan was one of those dogs which carelessly handled the food, and it slopped the food, it spilled out the food from the bowls. And other dogs also were in such a hurry because they knew that if any of them would be left behind and a bit slow, then perhaps they might not get any part of the meal, and it would be eaten away by the others. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So, when all the dogs had eaten their meal, Tricky would go and try to find out some food for himself. But poor Tricky, he could not find anything but the shining bowls, because all the food had been eaten up and licked up by the other dogs. So, seeing this, the doctor tried to keep a separate bowl for Tricky, and he was very happy to see that now Tricky was pushing the other dogs to run for his food. From then on, his progress was rapid. Now Tricky was getting used to this lifestyle, and he was getting more and more active day by day. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. Scrimmages are rough fights, and the whole day he used to play with other dogs, and he became very active and very lively. Until now, he had not been given any sort of medical treatment, and no surgery was being done upon the dog also. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. So the dogs indulged into playful activities, crushing and playing with each other. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely silky little object among the shaggy crew. Shaggy means very rough dogs, and Tricky was in no way a match to them because it had he had silken fur. He was very well cared and pampered by his mistress, and still those dogs accepted Tricky as a member of their pack. And Tricky used to spend his day fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times. So he had also learned all the tricks, how to attack on the food, and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. So all these very adventurous activities he had learnt here among these other dogs, and he had never had such a time in his life. This was memorable times, you can say, for Tricky over here. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. Now, how can we forget about Mrs. Pumphrey? She could not have been living peacefully without Tricky. So every time, a dozen times, you can say many a times in the day, she used to call up the doctor. She was all tensed up about Tricky's condition, and she wanted to know about the latest news. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. So, whenever Mrs. Pumphrey would be putting up such questions about his cushions being turned regularly and his proper coats were given to him according to the weather, the doctor used to give a very false reply. He used to avoid such type of questions asked by the lady. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. So the doctor assured the lady that Tricky was out of danger and he was recovering very quickly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. In fact, it was Mrs. Pumphrey who needed a treatment and not the dog. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. Her habit of feeding her dog had not gone away. She used to bring dozens of fresh eggs for Tricky so that he could gain some energy. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. The wine, which was brought by the lady to improve the hemoglobin of the dog, was actually gulped in by the doctor and his partner. They were having a ceremonial time there at the lunch time. They could have eggs in the breakfast and wine at the time of lunch and also in between the meal. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final end on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. On top of it, there was this brandy. Brandy is an alcoholic drink which was actually meant for the dog. But the doctor and his partners had a gala time. They had a well spent day consuming extra eggs at breakfast, wine at lunchtime, and a luxurious sip of brandy round the fire at night. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, so one could always want such a guest to remain with them. But I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. So, somewhere in his heart, his conscience did not allow him to hide this from the lady, as he knew that Mrs. Pumphrey loved the dog so dearly. So, he decided to call her up and tell her about the recovery of the dog, and she could come and collect him. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The moment Mrs. Pumphrey got this good news about her dog, a 30 feet long, shiny, black, luxurious car was standing outside the hospital. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Mr. Harriet could see Mrs. Pumphrey sitting inside the car. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" Mrs. Harriet seemed to be tense. Her hands were tightly pressed together in anxiety, and she wanted to be assured that her dog had really recovered well. "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. There were other hounds or dogs in the garden, and among them were the small Tricky, who was also seemed to be enjoying with ears flapping and tail waving. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. During these days, Tricky had become very active and energetic. His fat had been burned down now, and he has become a lean, lithe here means slim, and hard muscled animal. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house, the chauffeur was still holding the car door open. Chauffeur means driver, and he was waiting at the side of the gate, and the doctor carried the dog back to Mrs. Pumphrey. When Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. Tricky also seemed to be longing for Mrs. Pumphrey, and the moment he saw her once again, he jumped out of the doctor's arms into her lap. She gave a startled "ooh" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." So, children, we can see that Tricky also seemed to shower all his love on his mistress. While they were greeting each other, the doctor helped the chauffeur to bring out all those items of comfort which were never used by the dog at all. Mrs. Pumphrey was overwhelmed and her eyes were filled with gratitude. She thanked the doctor with trembling lips. She was pleased to see her Tricky back in good health, and she firmly believed that the operation was successful. But in reality, there was no such surgery. Tricky was now hale and hearty without any medicinal treatment, and so we can say that in real sense it was a triumph of surgery. So students, here we can see on what theme the story is based. It is about the blind love which we possess for the one whom we love the most. Mrs. Pumphrey had no idea that her blind and extreme love for her dog Tricky took him to trouble. We can also give credit to Dr. Harriet, who arrived at the right time to save Tricky from his over-concerned mistress.